coming to our speaker series. I would like to introduce our speakers tonight, Boyce and Libby Harvey FitzGerald. Thank you for coming, taking the time to prepare. I appreciate it. Boyce is a teacher at Petaluma High School, as well as a scientist. Science is the vehicle by which she teaches students how to think critically. And Lee has earned both the North Bay and the Sonoma County Teacher of the Year awards in her 25-year tenures at Petaluma High School. She received her bachelor's degree in chemistry from Sweet Briar College in Virginia and her master's in education from Claremont Graduate School in Southern California. Lee's passion to teach started in the first grade because she had a wonderful teacher who was always willing to answer her questions. Then in high school, we had another influential female chemistry teacher who solidified Lee's desire to teach. And she's been teaching ever since with a short hiatus into industry, which you will hear about today. Libby Harvey FitzGerald is a natural products chemist with a bachelor's degree in chemistry, also from Sweet Briar College in Virginia. And we're going to hear stories about that. She was the CEO of Alpha Chemical and Biomedical Laboratories in Petaluma, and after 17 years negotiated the acquisition by a European lab. Her mantra, good science is good business, carried her from an early career with the American Chemical Society in Washington, D.C. to California, and then onto the national stage in helping to establish laws and methods for analytical testing of original plant material, manufacturing process samples, and final bottle content/label integrity of herbal products and dietary supplements. Libby also has a strong community involvement that resulted in her North Bay Women in Business Technology Industry and Petaluma Citizen of the Year Award. My pleasure to welcome you.
All right. So we're trying to decide, let's see, should I stand here?
And we can be the same height.
Oh, there you go.
Perfect.
All right, thank you very much. It's good to see some new faces and old friends in the audience tonight. Thanks for coming. As Veronique said, I grew up on the East Coast in Charleston, West Virginia, and in Greenwich, Connecticut. And I actually never met Lee when we were at Sweet Briar College because I'm 10 years older than she is.
So we weren't there at the same time. So the way we met was when I went to a reunion at Sweet Briar in the mid-'80s. I went to see our favorite chemistry professor, and on his door was Libby's card, which said, Libby Harvey, Petaluma, California. Sweet Briar is in Virginia. So I was a long ways from home and thinking, wait, there's another Sweet Briar person in the same town that I'm living in. How did that happen? So when I came back, I looked her up. At that time, I was in industry also, and so we did some industrial projects together as well.
All right. So I think next, shall we talk about why we chose science and
Sure.
how we ended up at Sweet Briar?
You want to go first?
Sure. Actually, I think science chose me because on my mother's side, I come from a long line of grandfathers, great-grandfathers who were natural products pharmacists. Originally, they were from Switzerland. On my dad's side, he was a chemical engineer. So somehow I inherited those science genes, although none of my other 4 brothers and sisters did. Lucky me. So I was always curious about the way things worked all my life. Like when my dad would drop his Alka-Seltzer in the water and it would fizz, I'm going, well, I don't understand that. What makes that work? And he explained to me that it was the citric acid combining with the baking soda that reacted in the water to make it fizz. It's just like, combining vinegar and baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, together to clean out your drains or to make kids rockets, right? And also other things, like I learned that the American Indians finally figured out that you could chew on willow bark tree, and that would reduce your headache pain or your tooth pain. And it's because the bark had salicin in it, which is salicylic acid, natural aspirin.
So my history is similar. I have two siblings who did not go into science. My father is a doctor, my grandfather was an engineer. So I think growing up, you get some of that at home. But for me, as Veronique said, I began to think about teaching in the first grade. And my sister always says that's very unfair, that I knew exactly what I wanted to do. She was a voice and dance major, and it took her a long time to figure out what to do with that. But I always wanted to teach, I just didn't know what I wanted to teach. And I seemed to like every subject, but as I got into high school, there were some subjects I liked more than others. And I particularly liked science because it didn't seem to have a black or white answer. There were always questions, and the way my house worked, if you asked a question, you got 3 in return. So you very seldom got an answer to your question, and you often got a long series of, well, I wonder what, which was a little frustrating, but I think my students probably feel the same way because I do it in class. Well, that's a good question. These are former students of mine. As somebody said, somebody posted it on Facebook that I've been at Petaluma actually for 27 years, and so there was the article in the Argus about, if you took science in Petaluma in the last 27 years, you probably had Miss Boyce. I was Miss Forsyth before that, but same teacher. I've been at Petaluma High a long time. It was the curiosity and the fact that science always has another question behind it that made it interesting to me. I didn't like things that had a set answer, and I argued with a lot of English teachers about how they could possibly decide that this author meant this when they wrote this book, since they didn't know them and they weren't there. None of that made sense to me. So in high school, I decided I should teach chemistry, and I had a really great chemistry teacher in high school who was not a chemist. She was a biology teacher. She didn't really know how to teach chemistry, and she didn't know what to do with a bunch of us who were asking questions she didn't have the answers to. So she took us in her car over to the local, I went to Amley, so she took us to Santa Rosa JC to meet with a chemistry professor who answered our questions for us because she didn't know what they were. So it was really great, and I thought, that's the kind of teacher I want to be. So I just continued from there to stay with teaching as I went into college. And I chose Sweet Briar for a number of reasons. I was a horsewoman in high school, did a lot of equestrian work, and I wanted to ride in college, and I wanted to major in chemistry, and I wanted to teach. And there weren't a lot of colleges that offered me all of those opportunities. My dad was disappointed I didn't go to Harvard, but he also was disappointed I didn't go into medicine, so he got over it. But Sweet Briar was a great place to kind of write your own ticket. The liberal arts helped you to use your skills to do whatever you wanted to do. And because it was a women's college, there was no glass ceiling. Both Libby and I are a previous generation to some of you guys, who the glass ceiling's a little thinner, but it's still there. And so we really liked being at Sweet Briar. Nobody said you can't do that. You just could do anything you wanted.
Right, well, one of my high school chemistry teachers was the reason I went into chemistry too. I kind of liked the biology teacher too, he was fun. But looking at Sweet Briar College, I chose it because it was a strong liberal arts college, and they also had a program that allowed you to take a leadership role. The student-teacher ratio was amazingly small. In our chemistry major class, I think there were 5 or 6 of us, so it was like 5 to 1 teacher. It was fabulous. The other thing I loved about the college, although unlike Lee, I never even knew where the riding stables were. I knew where the tennis courts were. The campus was about 3,000 acres, still is, and it was just wide open for exploring.
It was beautiful. It has now a much stronger engineering and STEM kind of program with more, we were talking about where we learned to use the instruments that we both ended up using in industry. It wasn't at Sweet Briar, they didn't have that at that time. But the liberal arts component was interesting and frustrating. If you wanted to be a pure scientist, you hated having to take anthropology and English and sociology, but I knew I wanted to teach, and I knew the students I had would want to talk about more than just chemistry. And if I had gone to Harvard, I'd have had to take pretty much all chemistry and math, and I wouldn't have had that more rounded background that I needed to become a good teacher.
So, I didn't know really until my sophomore year that I was going to major in chemistry. I don't know if you knew your freshman year, but I chose Sweet Briar because they were building a new science building, and that was fabulous. At the beginning of sophomore year, we had to declare a major, right? So I chose chemistry, more focused on organic chemistry, but I also ended up minoring in math and in art history. And it's interesting because my art history teacher had gone to Florence after the floods to help renovate some of the artwork there. And I thought, oh, wow, that's fabulous. I can combine chemistry and my love of art and get into art restoration, until I figured out or learned more of how picky it was. So I went in another direction.
So when I left Sweet Briar, I came back to California and became a teacher in Southern California and taught for some time. I then moved up to Silicon Valley, where parents started saying things to me like, those who can do and those who can't teach. And I thought, wait a minute. And I was young and, maybe my late 20s, and I thought, wait, is that true? Wait, did I go into teaching because I couldn't be a chemist? I thought I made this choice of my own free will. So I left teaching for a while, partially because I had moved to Marin and they were doing they had very bad declining enrollment and they were doing layoffs. And Sonoma County didn't pay me enough to stay in teaching. So I went out into industry and I became an industrial chemist doing environmental, soil, water, and air testing. And I ran a mass spectrometer and I learned how to run all those instruments, and I really hated it. The bench chemistry was repetitious and boring, and the projects were kind of interesting, but running the same machine hour after hour after hour just about drove me nuts. So I became a project manager instead, which felt a lot more like teaching. I had chemists that I had to convince to do their homework. I had projects from typically engineers who didn't know anything about chemistry to convince about how they should run their projects. And then I had a boss telling me when the project was due. So that all felt very much like teaching to me. There were lots of timelines and lots of people who didn't want to do what you were asking them to do. And it worked pretty well for me. I did that for several years. But I really missed finishing a project. You set off a project, you did all these tests, and then you never knew what happened. We had samples that would fly in from Alaska about some oil spill, and then you never heard whether the oil spill got cleaned up or not. Or we'd have cards and felt flown in from a casino and asked, what's causing our people to get sick? And then you never knew whether they solved it or not. So it really seemed kind of weird to me. So I got a call from the principal at Casa Grande at the time who said, we need a chemistry teacher, are you still available? And I said, well, I'm actually working, but okay. So I came back into teaching, and I was actually teaching and doing industry for a while, which was in the East Bay, so I was commuting back and forth every morning. And then I went back into teaching, and I've been there pretty much ever since. I've been in a couple of different states, but I really love the teaching.
I was thinking, I actually did some teaching during my sophomore, junior, and senior years in college. I had to have a part-time job in college because I was partial scholarship and student loan. And actually, I got to work in the chemistry stockroom, making up reagents and things like that, and solutions. And my most fun was teaching the freshman chemistry lab. But alas, I didn't go into teaching. So, after Sweet Briar, I was able to go to Washington, D.C. and I will admit, I did not even have an appointment. I just walked in the door, cold turkey, with my resume. I'm pretty arrogant, I don't know. So I went to the American Chemical Society in Washington, D.C. That's our professional society. And it's about 4 or 5 blocks from the White House, to give you a positioning in D.C. where it is. And they happened to have an opening in the membership division. I landed this dream job right out of college, traveling all over the U.S., speaking at conferences, writing articles specifically so people who were non-scientists could understand the articles, and I loved every minute of it. And without my training in communication, whether it was speaking or writing both at home or at Sweet Briar, I would never have been able to do that. One of the other fun things about this first job is, some of you may remember the first Earth Day in April 1970. I was given free rein in setting up displays and videos at the American Chemical Society, and they invited the public to come to the first Earth Day there. So that was fun.
That's great. I have ended up blending my industry and my teaching experience from then on. So when I came to Petaluma, one of the problems with teaching is it doesn't pay very well. And so you usually have to do something else in the summer to make your bills. So I figured out I could use my industry experience in the summer. So even when I was teaching, I would take a summer job instead of being a summer school teacher, which I've never wanted to do. You know, I failed those kids once. I didn't really want to have them again. You know, summer school teaching isn't enrichment anymore. I did work at the JC one summer and taught chemistry at the JC, and I've taught a lot at Sonoma State, because what I started doing was finding other ways to supplement my income that increased I get bored easily, so I have to have something new. My teaching partner thinks I'm nuts because every year I redo every lab and everything that we do in the classroom. She's like, why don't we do what we did last year? It's like, because I didn't like that. Let's do it a little different this year. So I've been doing that for 43 years. You'd think I'd have a set curriculum at this point that I could just pull off the shelf and do, but it bores me, so I don't do that. So I taught at Sonoma State in their education department and worked with their student teachers, and I find that incredibly rewarding. In fact, in my science department at Petaluma High, all but one of them were student teachers of mine. I don't know whether that's making me begin to feel old, but it's great to add to the next generation and to help them grow up. In fact, right now, our newest science teacher was a student of mine. So she and I are working on her chemistry, and hopefully she will take over my chemistry spot when I go. So that's been really rewarding, but the other thing I do in summer is I go and do what Libby was just describing, use the communication and the liberal arts skills that we learn to write curriculum or to rewrite a novel, well, what do you call it, a workbook for people who are going to run the instrument who don't understand what it says. So you can translate this chemistry ease into something that a technician can use to run an instrument. My current thing that I'm doing is working with a gentleman here in town called TB Environmental, and we're writing a new curriculum project on air quality so that students can take something like a purple air, the purple airs that came about in 2017 with the fires. These are handheld, they're called air beams, and they live feed the data to your phone so you can go around and take air quality readings. And so I've written the curriculum for that, and we're in the process of funding that to roll out for all the teachers in Sonoma County this spring.
So I was trying to remember whether you were teaching at Petaluma High School when our lab came out as a hazmat call. Well, let me back up a little bit. So I was about 33 years old when I moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. And I worked for a couple of years planning to start this wonderful launch of this independent analytical lab that Veronique mentioned, Alpha Chemical and Biomedical Laboratories. We finally launched it in 1982. We had 16 local investors and We started off in a converted dentist lab down on Kentucky Street, on the north end of Kentucky Street. And I mean, back then, a computer cost like $6,000. They were pretty non-existent. But one of our earliest jobs at the lab was setting up hazardous material training for the fire departments in Petaluma and also the town of Sonoma. And we also created, along with the garbage company at the time, Sonoma County's first household hazardous waste collection day. And that was fun. But this story, Lee loves this story. Our lab responded to the police this time, not the fire department, a hazmat call at Petaluma High School at their swimming pool. So we arrived, we have students in the audience. Anyway, we arrived and discovered that there was a beautiful, bright purple color to the swimming pool, which is great because Petaluma High School colors are purple. But it wasn't beautiful when we took a closer look at it. We did some quick testing and found out this unknown purple color was caused by potassium permanganate, which is permanganate, which was an oxidizer eating away the coating of the inside of the pool.
And all the pipes.
And all the pipes and all the connectors.
And it turns a really ugly brown after.
Yeah,
it's
so
really purple.
what we did is we thought, okay, well, let's just dump this down the sewer. And we found out, this is what the high school was saying, but we found out, guess what? The high school pool at the time was not connected to the sewer, to the treatment plant. It went right into the storm drain into the river. And we thought, oh my God, we're gonna kill all the fish. So we came up with a compound that neutralized the potassium permanganate, and it precipitated out as this ugly brown stuff while it was eating up the pool. So the city did allow us to connect the pool water to the sewer system just that time to go to the wastewater treatment plant. So we didn't kill any fish. Anyway, I believe they finally found the student pranksters who did this. They were obviously involved in either a dairy farm or a chicken ranch where they used that particular dilute compound for sterilization. And I believe their parents ended up paying some major fines to refinish the pool and to pay our lab costs. So that's always a kind of a wild story. I mean, the other things that we did in the early 90s at the lab was, after this, we finally switched from environmental chemistry to natural products chemistry, which was our main expertise. And we started working with dietary supplements and herbal products in the areas of research and identification of compounds, and also developing analytical test methods for the products. And along with this, in 1994, I embarked on my first 2-week vacation to the Peruvian Amazon, along with a bunch of pharmacists and chemists and physicians and other professors to study pharmacy from the rainforest. This was a major turning point in my life, not only because of personal growth, but professionally, all kinds of connections that definitely increased our business growth.
And I remember coming to your lab just after that, and one of the things you were testing was like ginkgo biloba. And nobody in those days knew what anything was. There were no dosages on it. It didn't tell you how pure it was. We had a couple of students actually do some work in Libby's lab to just kind of see what you do when you work in a lab. But that was one of the connections, was what do you do with this stuff? You know, even now, my father used to complain that people would say, no, I don't take any other drugs. There are no contraindications to this drug you're going to give me. Oh, but I do take 16 herbal supplements. Like, well, what are those? And so it was really interesting to see how her lab was designing methods to test for what was in these supplements. We were saying the other day about cannabis, and you know, when you go to buy something, you don't know what's in it, you don't know what the dosage is. When they say, oh, it's 325 milligrams, you say, in what? In 1 milligram, in 1 ounce, in one, what do you mean? Oh, I don't know, but the bottle has, oh, great. So there's still a lot of growth to be had in that industry, and one of the things that we try to talk about in class, right, is the basics. One of the frustrations of teaching high school chemistry is it's so basic that until you get a little farther down the line, you can't see how you can take all these basics and apply them to really cool other situations.
Oh, interesting. So, because of what Lee was saying, I ended up getting involved, or my entire lab did. I didn't do all this by myself. I had some wonderful employees and definitely some fabulous CEO coaches along the way. One was an old friend of mine from the East Coast, and another, many of you know, Susan Starbird, who was this marketing wizard. At any rate, I volunteered and was also appointed to several national committees that were working on establishing testing standards for things like ginkgo biloba. And, you know, it's easy to tell, you know, if it's half sawdust, which we did see on quite a few samples. But we're talking about pure samples that start out with good source material. So I served on these national committees with people from National Institutes of Health, Food and Drug Administration, and set up actually the first analytical lab testing committee for the American Herbal Products Association. Along the way, I was also instrumental in setting up a national seminar series called Botanicals, Let's Talk Science, not Let's Talk, oh gee, this is really good for my brain or whatever. So we ended up doing contract work with Food and Drug Administration and the NIH and attorneys. But mostly for major importers in the U.S. and manufacturers of herbal products in the U.S.
So I think what's interesting about our two careers is that you can take what you know and apply it to a lot of different situations. When I was first approached by someone to do curriculum design, it took me to China and to India several times to teach, quote unquote. But a lot of people say, well, you're a teacher, you know, what do teachers do? You stand in front of a class and say stuff, you know, and there's just so much more to that that you can grow from. So my trips to China and India were by grace of, I guess, Agilent Technology sent me to, again, teach a curriculum to their teachers. And the first year that I went to China, what was so interesting to me is that the Chinese teachers were, and unfortunately I'm sort of seeing it go back this way now, but very boxed in. Well, what's the right answer? It's like, what do you mean, what's the right answer? We're doing an experiment. I don't know what the right answer is. We'll find out after we do it. And that was a really unusual response for them. They wanted, is it A, B, or C? And we went back 3 years in a row, and I really saw a lot of growth over those 3 years, partially because the Chinese scientists at Agilent were very forward-thinking and said, the one guy who took us around used to get quite angry in Chinese, so I didn't really understand what he was saying, but he would tell me afterwards, I said, what were you yelling about? You sounded angry. He said, I was telling them that the reason that we don't ever invent anything new is because we don't think outside the boxes, and I was pointing at all the Nobel laureates that were not from China and saying we need to change that because we need to think outside the box. And so it really was interesting to watch them kind of go through that for several years, and like I said, I'm a little sad to see what's going on in the news today, that it's sort of going back the other way, but their teachers were so empowered and so freed to be told, you can do an experiment and not know what the answer is. And you can just take what the answers are and grow from there. And the kids loved it. So the Chinese students, most of them spoke pretty good English, which was helpful since my Mandarin is non-existent. But we did that for 3 years in a row, and we worked with groups of students and groups of teachers. And then in 4th year, we went to India and worked with those teachers for a year. And that was a little harder to fit into their social schema. Because female teachers weren't really worth anything. So I refused to go back the 2nd year. I said, you need to send a mail. It's just, I can't walk that bridge. It's not going to happen in the next year. So there were some interesting things that for me were very unexpected. We went to a women's college. Nobody ever said you can't do that. I remember the first American Chemical Society meeting I showed up to and went to get my name tag, and they said, wait, you're a woman. I said, well, thank you for noticing. My first name is Lee, so I get a lot of that. But I was annoyed that I was at an American Chemical Society meeting, and because it was chemistry, I was assumed to be male. In teaching, that feels less of a problem. I don't feel that kind of distinction, although we still have very few female physics teachers. There are a lot of female chemistry teachers, but there are very few who teach physics. Mostly because you can make a whole lot more money doing physics somewhere else. But, I think you can take what you learn, and I've always said to students who've asked, find something you're passionate about and do that. As long as you love what you do, it never feels like work. If you don't like what you do, I could make a lot more money in industry. I did make a lot more money in industry. I had actually a lot shorter hours than I do teaching, even though I was a project manager and on call 7 days a week. I didn't do as much homework and worrying about kids, right? I wake up in the middle of the night thinking, I know what I can do to make Nick turn his homework in. He lets me pick on him, so it's okay. But it's just with you all the time. And it wasn't like that in industry. I could turn it off and come back and turn it off and come back. But it's my passion. So I tell new teachers, if this isn't your passion, you shouldn't do this. It's only getting harder, it's not getting easier, and the money's not getting better, faster. So, it really, I tell them it's like the priesthood, right? There's a lot of reward, but there's not a lot of money.
Interesting, one of the things you mentioned, Lee, is being a woman and breaking into a man's world. My first job at the American Chemical Society, 8 stories, and I don't know how many employees were there, probably 400 at least. After I took the job, I was the 3rd woman, and it was difficult at times. I didn't quite understand, why there weren't more women in science. It's like I was never told it was no big deal, to have a woman in science. I was always told with our college and my parents, you can do anything you want to. And there's many of you here in this room that have been in that situation, I know. So at this point, shall we open it for questions? I don't know the time. This thing went out. Oh, there it is, right on the wall.
That's all I need. I need a clock on the wall.
Your eyes go right
Is
through
the
it.
bell gonna ring? Wait, no. Oh, sure.
This is a question, hello, for Libby. I know that the alpha that you created then ended up being purchased by Eurofence, is that right? Is there any relationship with the current alpha that's now in Petaluma?
Oh, no, that particular Alpha Laboratories originated in Ukiah. And I remember after we started the lab, they opened what was called Alpha Analytical Labs in Ukiah. And we did have a little battle with them, but we lost. But because Alpha
Here's the letter.
is a letter. So, no, that has nothing to do with us. As a matter of fact, after the acquisition of by Eurofins, I was brought back in by the staff there, up in Redwood Business Park, because I had left after about 4 years after the acquisition and went into private consulting with other analytical labs. Apparently they had lost all of their intellectual capacity, and they didn't even know anything about the history of the lab, so they brought me back in to give them that history lesson. But the lab no longer exists now. Eurofins shut that lab down last year and transferred all of their employees and equipment to labs in Southern California and in Colorado.
I have a question for both of you. So Libby, will you tell us your most interesting highlight about what you discovered about food supplements and whether they're real or helpful or not, or any light you can shed on that? And then just for fun, Lee, tell us your favorite experiment to teach kids and why it's your favorite experiment.
Oh boy, Colleen. All right, I'm a label reader. Many of you in this room know that. All I can say is that as much as we try to standardize dietary supplements and herbal products, there are some despicable, dishonest companies in this country and around the world that are not, they don't play the game, all right? And they're willing to put anything in a bottle to sell it. And so buyer beware. I belong to, I have a membership in consumerlab.com, which is an excellent source of information about validity of dietary supplements. You do have to pay to belong, but any of you can join. It's consumerlab.com. And there are other sources. You can always call me. I love those kind of questions from my friends. But there are many, many dietary supplements that are excellent. The main problem I think you get to is when you have some of these combo products that have like 20 different things in one bottle. I tend to shy away from those.
Like smart water?
Like smart water.
My favorite lab to teach the kids, they're about to start in January, kids, right, they're 16-year-olds, is called the Copper Cycle. So it's a lab that you often do in college, where I give the kids a piece of copper and they change it into 5 different copper compounds and then eventually come back to copper. And it takes about 3 weeks and my lab becomes full of thousands of blue beakers, because well, there aren't thousands, but 60 students times 5 beakers is a lot of beakers. And everybody has their own beaker in their own stage. It was more fun before the internet, because they couldn't look up what to do next. It's more interesting since the internet, because they look up what to do next, and that isn't the right thing to do. So last year, actually, teaching and distance learning, that was the most interesting thing to me. It was a game about whether I could ask questions that they couldn't Google. So I rewrote every test so that the questions, if I could Google it and got an answer, it wasn't a question on the test. So in fact, I think it's easier in the classroom when they can just memorize a bunch of stuff and repeat it. I didn't do anything that was memory last year because they could Google it. What's the point? I changed all the elements. So at Christmas, I made a periodic table with the reindeers. So there was Rudolphium and Prancerum and things like that. And I made up all these new compounds that were made of things that they couldn't look up. And so the copper cycle is a little like that. If they look it up and it says, get your vacuum filtration system set up with a Buchner funnel, and they come in and say, this is what I'm going to do, and I say, where? Because we don't have a vacuum system and I don't have any Buchner funnels, so try again. And I give them a list. Here's all the stuff you do have. This is a high school lab. And here's, so that's all you can use is the stuff I told you. Why did you look up this one that has stuff you didn't? So it's that sort of how do you filter the junk you can look up on the internet and actually learn what you're doing instead of just look for the answer, which is sort of this whole group, right? Look for the answer. Not Nick, he doesn't do that. These guys.
This is a question for Lee.
Sure.
I was just wondering, what year was it that you decided not to go back to India? Because I was just wondering if that perception of a woman couldn't teach English, if that was long enough ago that it would be better.
That's a great question. Maybe 15 years? It's been a while. I went with a female engineer from Agilent and another woman teacher, but it was very difficult. But it has been at least 15 years probably. Did you have a question?
Yeah. You mentioned the things that you didn't like about, thank you. You mentioned things that you didn't like about certain about certain supplements and so forth. Could you give us an example, maybe the honey, for example? I love that one.
You want to talk about honey?
Well, honey is not a dietary supplement, but
Excuse me.
yeah, what John is talking about, excuse me a second. Thank you. Some of the strange things that end up in a testing lab. One time we received a questionable shipment of honey from China, and they were trying to figure out what was the off taste to the honey. It was strange. Now, we're taught as chemists, you do not taste anything that comes in the front door of the lab, for sure. It might be down on the floor. So we did an infrared analysis first, and bingo, up it pops. That was really easy. It happened to be bunker fuel, heavy oil in the honey. The Chinese had not used a safe food-grade shipment container to ship the honey. They had taken a bunker fuel container, thought they rinsed it out and cleaned it, filled it with honey, and shipped it to the U.S. Lovely.
A funnier story than that. When I was in industry and we were you get samples, they come in these coolers, and then you open them up and you look at the samples and you figure out what to do with them, then you send them off to the appropriate people. So when I was project managing, I had someone in the receiving department call me and say, Lee, I think you better get down here. There's this really strange shipment. And I thought, oh no, it was a Friday afternoon. I thought, sure, here goes my weekend. And so I go running down there, and these guys are kind of giggling, and I said, what? They opened up this ice chest, and it was full of live crawdads from a client I had in Louisiana who had sent them as a thank you so that we could have a crawdad boil for the weekend. I was like, what? But it had come in his regular, shipping container with all the right paperwork on the front. It was hilarious. And I remember another time I worked out here at Sola Optical, and we were making lenses, right, eyeglass lenses in the summer. That was a summer job while I was teaching. And this was a research facility, so they did most of their production in Australia, I believe. And this was just their research lab. It was out by Fireman's Fund, or now over by Kaiser, right? And we would try out new kinds of lenses. And one of the problems that I was asked to solve was that the lenses that they were making had a sort of yellow tinge because of the plastic and the way it reflected the light. And that was acceptable in Europe, but it wasn't acceptable in the US. Nobody liked this sort of yellow tinge. So we were trying to add a blue something or other to counteract the yellow to make it look more natural. But every time we did the experiment, we got different results, and nobody could figure out what was going on. And so I went out into the lab and I said, would you guys just show me what it is you're doing? Because it was a union-run shop, and so there were union technicians that did the work, and then they brought it to you and you did the tests in the lab. And I said, something is wrong. I mean, I'm doing all the calculations, I'm telling them what to mix, and every time I get it, I get different results. So I went out, and it was kind of like your bunker oil. They weren't cleaning out the reaction vessel in between each trial. So because when they were doing manufacturing, they didn't clean it out. It was always the same stuff, so they just dumped it into the same container and did it over and over. These were individual research tests. And so because they weren't cleaning it out, sometimes it had some of this left over, and sometimes it had some of that left over. And I was going nuts trying to figure out what it was. But again, back to the problem solving, right? You can't Google that. You have to think about what the issues are and try and figure out what all the little problems could have been, and sometimes that's hard to find.
It is, and I think of, you reminded me when you were talking earlier about one interesting job that we had at the lab. This was involving a very famous actress named Elizabeth Taylor, who was working with an attorney's firm in San Francisco, and they were looking for a lab to represent her, or at least try to figure out what was going on. She happened to develop Passion perfume. Does anybody remember Passion? I think it's still around, I don't know. Anyway, she was having a fight with her boyfriend at the time. I think that was the used car salesman down in Los Angeles, who claimed he had developed Passion perfume. And she goes, no, I developed it. So they gave us samples that Elizabeth Taylor had and he had. And we went to San Francisco and bought authenticated control samples. You have to do this in chemistry. I mean, you can test products all the time, but unless you have control samples and blanks, you don't know for sure that your answer is correct. So we bought Chanel No. 5 and 3 other fancy perfumes. We put them all on the mass spectrometer, the gas chromatograph mass spectrometer at work. And what happens when you do that, and you just need like a little microliter, half a microliter of perfume, because it's powerful. You have this beautiful fingerprint of thousands of chemical compounds, just these spikes one after another coming off of the mass chromatograph recorder. And each of them has its own special fingerprint, just like the human fingerprint. So we settled this case out of court very quickly. Her Passion perfume, definitely her original matched the current Passion perfume. You could do an overlay and see that they were exactly the same. His was not, and the others were totally different. So it's interesting how you can pick different scientific instrumentation to give you answers that you would never know by just smelling these perfumes. So they settled the case out of court. And
You got a lot of good perfume.
and we had 5 beautiful bottles of perfume that we divided up amongst us, and they were practically full.
I have a question about science, education, and politics.
That sounds like a loaded question.
And given that we have actually for decades, but earlier it was much more subtle, an unfortunate demonization and discrediting of information, and particularly of expertise and scientific expertise that has gone on. And I wonder what the challenges are in an environment like that, and how you have adapted maintaining the importance of science as you are teaching it at the high school level?
Chicken.
So the question
Right.
about science.
So I think even back when I left teaching to go into industry because parents were asking me if I really had the expertise to be in the classroom, that was the first time I left teaching, was so that I could say to parents, and still do at back to school night, I have been an industrial chemist, I have been in industry, I know how that works. And it takes away a lot of the questions from parents about whether I'm qualified to do what I do. That doesn't worry me so much anymore, but 20 years ago it did. But I think the difficulty in teaching science in general is twofold. One, interest in science begins very young. So I did a whole series of studies with the Cal State schools about at what point do people turn on or off to science. And it's like 3rd grade. So one challenge in education is to promote more science teaching in the elementary schools, which is done best with support from people who know science, because a lot of elementary school teachers are not comfortable with teaching science. They don't have the facility for it, not personally, but their own facility, right? They don't have labs, they don't know how to set those up. And so I've done, not so much here in Petaluma, it's been difficult to do mentorships in Petaluma for some reason. But in other districts I've sent students, junior students, to the elementary schools to do labs. It's great peer teaching, the kids love it, the teachers love it. I've had a difficult time getting that going here. The other problem is that we find even students who are extremely interested in science get to the university level and they say, this is really hard work and it takes a lot more hours than my friend, in my case my roommate, who was an Italian studies major. She went to class from 9 to 12, she was done all afternoon. I had a class at 8 in the morning, I had a lab that went till 6 at night. And so unless you have a passion for that, you start thinking, wait a minute, what am I doing? And there isn't the monetary reward that there was in science in the Sputnik area, right? In times when scientists were paid a lot more. If you go into business and are successful, or you go into economics, you can make a lot more money. Hedge fund managers make a lot more money, right, than scientists do. So I think it's hard to get students to believe that there are 2 reasons to study science. One, it makes you a better thinker in general, so you can make better judgments about things that the world is doing as a whole. And 2, you can solve some of the world's problems that other people can't. So when we look at global climate change, even the student I talked to this afternoon, who's at George Washington, a former student of mine, called me and said he's studying economics, but he's doing a study at the moment about how energy, the use of energy around the world, is affecting not only socioeconomic, right? If you don't have energy, you can't cook your food. If you live out in the country and you don't have energy, you can't. He was calling me about how the power shutoffs in Sonoma County had affected people in Sonoma County and how it had affected people unevenly in Sonoma County. So he is studying economics, but he said, I'm so glad for the honors chemistry class I took from you, because it allows me to think critically and it allows me to understand this energy flow that I'm using in this other job that I'm doing, which is going to school. So I think I stay away from the politics. I don't want to do politics in the classroom in any way, shape, or form. I try to stick to facts. Science is about facts. It's not about which party you belong to or what you believe. It's about what you can prove and what the evidence shows. Did I answer your question? I felt like I rambled a little.
I think that was pretty articulate.
Okay.
Any other question?
Probably ready to go home and have dinner.
Just curious, you're the firm started here. Lee, you spoke to a number of startup and hyper-growth companies. What's the current culture in
or is that not a growth early started that's popular here?
Yeah, the question was about growth in Petaluma, economic growth from scientific businesses. And I think that if you take a look at some of the construction on South McDowell, you will see a huge scientific company, and they are actually kind of bioscience based. I don't know the name of the company. It's very similar to BioMarin, if it's not BioMarin, or BioSys. There's quite a few pharmaceutical, biotechnology type firms, biochemistry firms that are in that South McDowell Business Park area. And I know that the city of Petaluma's economic development department is promoting these types of industries in Petaluma. They attract highly paid, highly qualified scientists, which was always a difficult job for us at the lab, is attracting qualified people, because the salary base here in Sonoma County used to be quite low compared to San Francisco, Oakland, or other parts of California along the coast. So I think that's improving for the people that live in Sonoma County to be able to find good paying jobs here that are in their field of interest, so they don't have to commute to the South Bay or the East Bay or San Francisco. If you want to find a list of those types of companies in Petaluma, I would contact Ingrid Alverdi at the Economic Development Department of the City of Petaluma.
Any further questions or comments?
You both spoke about, or alluded to, certainly the influence of teachers and mentors. But I would love to hear from each one of you the one person that would be your role model, or have influenced you in such a way that made that particular difference that you can even reference daily.
That's a hard one. I mean, I think it starts when you're young at home. For me, it was that first grade teacher. She was just an incredible teacher, and I thought, oh, that's something I could really enjoy doing. And then when I got to high school, there was another teacher like that. At our university, I think we both adored the same organic chemistry professor. And for me, he was not only a great chemistry professor, but he played the clarinet in the Lynchburg Symphony, and I was a French horn player in high school. And when I got there, he said, oh, you play French horn, you should come with me to the symphony. So he would drive me to the symphony, and I played in the Lynchburg Symphony with him, and he and I played a duet in our little chapel at Sweet Briar one winter term. We had this 4x4 schedule. So he probably was the one person in university that kept me going in chemistry. Even when I took a junior year abroad, I went to University of St. Andrews, and that was a great learning experience socially, but there were no professors there that I knew closely like I did Dr. Mclennan. And he was just a really outstanding teacher. That he was colorblind, so he used to say to us, I'm going to do this experiment, and the beaker's going to change from whatever to whatever, and you're going to have to tell me when that happens. But he was just one of those guys, and it was, as Libby said, small classes, maybe 25 kids in an organic chemistry class. In my graduating class, there were only 3 chemistry teachers. So if you're planning to go to university and sleep through lecture, you don't go there, right? There are 3 of you and the teacher, that's it. You're not sleeping through anything. But he was just a great guy. So he probably was the one. I used to even write to him after I started teaching and say, this is really frustrating. How do you keep doing this all this time? And he would always say, well, it's about whether you love what you're doing. And clearly he did.
Yes, Dr. John Mclennan. I remember him. He was a big influence on my life, too. But maybe you didn't know that he also had a band that we used to dance to at school.
That's where he played that clarinet.
That's right. But also growing up, I think my grandmother and my mother were huge influences on me, especially with nature, getting into natural products. My dad, being a chemical engineer, was my go-to science guy. Sometimes I hated to ask him questions because I'd be there for like 3 hours listening to answer after answer, but oh my gosh, I learned so much and I adored him. And after my parents, I would say probably my high school chemistry teacher and Dr. Mclennan. Excuse me.
That's great.
I just want to say that my son had you, Lee Boyce, in chemistry at Petaluma High, and he was very grateful and feels very fortunate to have been in your class, and feels that you were a major influence on his career. Thank you.
Thank you. She's coming this way. She doesn't want that microphone.
She's seated. You want this microphone?
I'll share with you.
Okay.
I just want to thank these two absolutely extraordinary women for coming tonight. If there's any question about coming to a speaker series, please don't miss any in the future. They're pretty darn wonderful, so thank you, Libby. Thank you, Lee. Now, this hasn't been food tested by your lab, Libby, but I'm kind of trusting their lab is good, and the chemistry is fabulous. So I'm giving them each a box of C's chocolates as a thank you for coming tonight. Sorry, that's just the phone number that you don't want. Bay Area quality, air quality. So thank you. Please join us again for Women's Club activities and events. Lee, you're welcome as our guest anytime.
Thank you.
And our next speaker will be something kind of unusual and fun down the road. It's going to be one of the lead performers and singers with underneath the boxes in the hen house. So we'll jump from STEM to art. And as they used to say when I studied biology at ASU, it was STEAM, adding art into science education. So thank you everybody for coming tonight. Enjoy your dinner later, and we really appreciate your joining us and showing support for our speaker series.